Were you guys the only ones that came out?
Oh, yeah.
What happened to like Brandon and I were all worked up about? I'll mock him tomorrow. You couldn't get Jack to come?
Huh?
You couldn't get Jack to come?
No. Listen, he's a fake friend.
That's what I'm saying.
That was brisk. I went over to Mitts.
Oh.
Happy birthday! So this is what you do on your birthday. You know they've got programs to help you with that.
I know. Yeah. Happy birthday. Here's a new.
Yay.
That's Bill Oxford's daughter. Julie Oxford, Bill's daughter, mom and dad. Jules.
Yes. Oh my gosh! Hello. How are you? Okay, so Nick and I go back to high school. Way back.
Ready?
I
Larry, we ready? All right, I'd like to welcome all of you here to our last presentation of the Kent Miller Quinton Reeves Honorary Lecture Series for this academic year. And we'll start back up in September as well. Today, our presentation is by our government instructor, Nick Pugh. There you go. His presentation is on the influence of North Texas on U.S. Nuclear policy. Professor Pugh earned a Bachelor of Science in Government at the University of Texas in Austin. And then he earned a Juris Doctorate from Texas Wesleyan University. I'm not allowed to say that it's now Texas A&M Law School because he's OUT. But he has a Juris Doctorate from there. He has worked, besides being a government instructor, he has been an attorney, an arms dealer, as well as a professional chef. So today he has whipped up a rather interesting discussion about how North Texas was involved in the Cold War. So with that, Professor Pugh.
Thank you. Okay, first of all, thanks everybody for being here, particularly to my parents. Thank you very much. And my father, my academic hero. Probably a little bit of a surprise to him, particularly considering some of my academic success and not so much success in my career. But I'm glad they're here. Dad asked earlier, and I think half jokingly, why I chose this topic. The truth is I've always been interested in this. I heard stories early on in my life about Dad's service in the Navy during the Vietnam era on a nuclear-powered boat that served surface-to-air cover in the Gulf of Tonkin and probably had the capacity to nuclear arm some of those surface-to-air missiles. That would have been appropriate. That's certainly something that missile system was capable of doing. When we were kids, I remember when we lived in Stephenville going to Fort Worth, and you always went to the mall, and you always saw B-52s. I mean, anybody that grew up in this area, in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, that was just ubiquitous. They were always there, setting off car alarms as they flew over the mall. In the mid-1980s, we lived in upstate New York within a stone's throw of Knowles Atomic Power Laboratory. Knowles does nuclear research. Actually, they do nuclear research and ship engine design for the Navy. And then other things. And we don't know a lot about what those other things are. One of our dear friends, his father worked for Knowles, and the guys got curious one day and opened up this gentleman's briefcase, and it just had an apple in it. He wasn't allowed to bring anything home or take anything from home to the office, apparently, other than an apple. Knowles has kind of some interesting secrecy associated with it, but it's related to its nuclear history. At any rate, child of the 80s living under the mushroom cloud or the threat thereof, that's probably the origin of this. I realized last night as I was kind of going through my notes that the truth is that this subject is way too big for an hour. So I've tried to truncate this some. We do have to talk about the 3 major Air Force bases in this area, and the reason that we're talking about the Air Force bases in particular is because of the nuclear triad, the truth is that the north central Texas is just not a great place to build submarine bases. That leaves us with the other two blades of the nuclear triad, our strategic bombing capacity and, of course, missile capacity. Now, we'll find out later that the missiles are not in Texas for very long, and they were very selective. So we'll talk a little bit about Carswell, Shepard, and Dyess. We're going to do a little bit of history of U.S. nuclear policy. We are actually, and I promise it's not a joke, very lucky to have Daryl here with us today, Daryl Castillo, who actually worked in the Reagan administration in the 1980s and is a good source of information with respect to Reagan's particular approach to U.S. nuclear policy at the time. Talk a little bit about the B-36. Those of you who remember the Jimmy Stewart film, Strategic Air Command, that was the plane. Those were built here in Fort Worth, or in the Fort Worth area, and of course the first one very cleverly named the city of Fort Worth. We will also talk about the Nike missile system. The Nike missile system was deployed as an air defense system for the Metroplex, for the Dyess Air Force Base defense area, and around Bergstrom Air Force Base in Austin. Again, that's a surface-to-air missile system that was capable of carrying a nuclear payload. Obviously, we're going to have to talk a little bit about the B-52 and its use as a weapon of deterrence. The B-1 Lancer, and it's coming to Texas in the late 1970s, early 1980s. Those are flown out at Dyess now. And finally, we'll spend a little bit of time talking about Atlas and his Texas boots. The only intercontinental ballistic missile that was deployed in the state of Texas for any period of time that was significant was the Atlas F system, and we'll talk about that a little bit as well. So Carswell gets its start when the city fathers in Fort Worth at the time decided that they wanted a base. They had an Army airfield before World War II, and in World War II it ends up being used for training purposes, and after that there's some question about what are we going to do with the base. Strategic Air Command was going to be born pretty quickly, about the time that they decide they're going to, the city of Fort Worth is going to try to get consolidated aircraft to come in and build a bombing or a bomber manufacturing plant there. It is in fact consolidated that ends up building the B-36. I do think that it's worth noting as we move forward in this discussion, we're talking about Fort Worth, Wichita Falls, and Abilene, and in all three cases, it is in fact the city itself that is inviting the military in, which I think is really interesting. It's not that the military sought out Abilene or sought out Wichita Falls or even arguably Fort Worth. The city themselves decide, we want this here. And then, as is often the case, you invite the federal government in and they grow very large. In Fort Worth, the desire to have the airfield there came immediately after, or the updating it and moving it towards the bombing comes immediately after Pearl Harbor. Even though the Air Force base, or the Army base there had predated that, they'd done World War I training there. Kind of interesting. It was called Tarrant Field for a long time, and then gets renamed Carswell later. After World War II, Strategic Air Command operations really gear in there. The strategic operations, or the Strategic Air Command operations there, are geared around the B-36 and then later some other strategic bombers. But the B-36 is certainly one of the more interesting ones and ends up being part of the 7th Air Command, the 7th Bombardment Command. B-36 is the largest piston-driven airplane ever constructed and ever flown. It dwarfs even the B-52. It's massive. I have no idea how large the thing was until I started looking at the scales. In fact, it's so large that at some point they decided to retrofit them, and they added some jet boosters at the very end of the wings. And then I think that they would talk, when they would run these, they would say we have 6 turning and 4 burning. These were takeoff assistance devices, but it did help them extend the amount of time that the bomber could be in the air. That's really important in terms of the Strategic Air Command's approach during the Eisenhower administration as it applied to our deterrent against a Soviet attack. We were behind the 8 ball on missile development. We just were not keeping up with the Soviets. And that, what would later be called the missile gap, created some serious concern in the Eisenhower administration. And so they adopted a policy that we'll look at here shortly, that it would include keeping bombers in the air as much as possible at what they call a fail-safe point. So the bombers would take off with their devices loaded, they would go to their fail-safe points, and then they would wait. And if they didn't get an execute order, they went home, which is an unusual way to run it, but that's, it ultimately deals with, you can't have your gear on the ground in the event of a first strike. So if our bombers are in the air, then you're trying to maintain equilibrium with the Soviet Union so that the Soviets know if we give a first strike with missiles, bombers are in the air, they will be able to return with a retaliatory strike. We'll explain that a little bit more as we move forward. Of course, eventually we replaced B-36 with a couple of other strategic planes. And eventually we get the B-52. The B-52 now one of the longest serving pieces of military hardware, originally designed in the 1950s, and we're still using them. It's a long-range heavy bomber and is now primarily used for the purposes that it was originally designed, which was just carpet bombing, long-range carpet bombing. Some of the planes from Carswell and many of the planes from Shepherd are involved in the arc light missions during the Vietnam era, where we just absolutely unloaded as much as we could on the North Vietnamese, oftentimes to no avail. Not perfect. SAC in the early 1970s, mid-1970s, retrofits the B-52s at Carswell Air Force Base with the ability to carry air-launched cruise missiles. And at that point, those planes go on strategic alert as well. And we'll talk about one of the missions that they did out of Shepherd with planes that were armed similarly, called Operation Chromedome. Insert ball joke. We'll talk about that as well as we move on, but it's worth noting, again, you've got now this, so the city has invited this in, the base grows, it becomes part of the Strategic Air Command. As it becomes part of the Strategic Air Command, and we increase that base's nuclear capacity, it jumps up the list of targets for the Soviet Union. So that by the 1970s and 1980s, Fort Worth, Dallas area is a tier 1 target. We're number 1. We're first to go. And we're an overkill zone. And at the time, before the START treaties were instituted, these were times when the Soviets and the United States were deploying missiles with what they called multiple re-entry vehicle capacity. More than one warhead per missile, up to 7, depending on which missile you're looking at, independently targetable. So it's reasonable to conclude that the Soviets the plan would have been to blanket the Dallas-Fort Worth area and multiple independently targetable warheads, likely in the low megaton yield range, so 1.5 megatons or so, which, by the way, is still not a good time. It's considerably larger than anything that we had deployed, and just massively larger than anything we did with respect to Hiroshima or Nagasaki. We'll run through some of those numbers as well. Shepherd is in Wichita Falls. Again, the city says, hey, we would like to have a military base, and we think we want to have an Army base. Excuse me, an Air Force base, an airfield. Shepherd is a training unit for the most part. I have a very good friend that actually trained at Shepherd. They trained electricians and other maintenance personnel there, and battlefield operation personnel, including personnel who were trained to work on power plants on the B-52s, which is how B-52s end up effectively at Shepherd and become involved in operations like Chromedome. Again, Shepherd's a Tier 1 target because of the type of alert status that it maintained with respect to its vehicles. I want to get to the Operation Chromedome map. So, in the 60s, we decide that in order to compensate for the missile gap, as we're kind of catching up with the Atlas system, we need to keep our bombers in the air basically 24 hours a day. You don't ever want to cross into Soviet territory, so the plan was, and this was done until 68, I think, we will leave Shepherd and fly to the East Coast, make a hard right turn, at which point they would get refueled in the air by a stratotanker. They would then turn north and fly way far north, across the top of Canada, clipping Thule Air Base in Greenland, turn, go to Alaska. They would then be refueled in this area over the Pacific and return to Shepherd. 24 hours a day, 365 days a year, every single one of them armed with nuclear devices, which, as you can imagine, is potentially pretty dangerous. Again, because the scope of this conversation is too large for an hour, I'm kind of trying, I may try to figure out how to do a lecture next semester on the types of devices that were associated with this kind of thing. Suffice it to say, there have been accidents. We've done the whole broken arrow thing, and whoops, we dropped one. We didn't really mean to, and have been very fortunate up to this point that we've managed to keep at least one safety device from failing. Chromedome doesn't last very long because eventually the ICBM changes everything, including for us. And it alters the way in which we plan for and would theoretically conduct a nuclear exchange with the Soviet Union. Dyess Air Force Base in Abilene. Anybody from Abilene? Super flat. I was surprised. Not a lot in Abilene. Abilene is a training base. They actually trained Thunderbolts there. I didn't know that, but they did Thunderbolt training there, which I think is really great. Some reconnaissance training as well. Then they moved to the Strategic Air Command, and as part of Strategic Air Command operations at Dyess, they install 13 Atlas F ICBM sites. The Atlas F is an unusual rocket, and we'll talk about this later, an unusual missile. Part of the reason that it's odd is that it uses a balloon tank for its fuel. And in order for the rocket to stand vertically, it has to have pressure in the tank all the time. If there's not pressure in the tank, the rocket will actually collapse on itself. To compensate for this, they would inject the balloon with about 5 psi of nitrogen all the time. And then if they reached an alert status, depending on which version of the rocket you had, F is different, but in D&E, the rocket would be lifted from a horizontal position to a vertical position like this, and then be refueled. And during refueling, they were fueled with liquid oxygen. It would drive the nitrogen out of the tank. Later, they decide that the raising process takes too long. They were losing about 10 minutes of launch time, which makes a difference. So Dyess, and this is one of the really key influences that North Texas has on our policy, Dyess is one of the first places where we see hardened missile silos. The silos are designed to take 100 psi overpressure. So you've all seen that video of the bomb going off and there's a wood frame house and it flexes and flies apart. That's like about 10 psi overpressure. 100 psi overpressure is to compensate for the high yield for the potentially high-yield nuclear devices deployed by the Soviet Union. So these missiles silos are super hardened, and at Dyess, they decide we're going to deploy them vertically. They're inside the missile silo itself, standing vertically, pressurized with nitrogen. If they get a launch code, an elevator would lift the missile to the surface to be refueled with liquid nitrogen, and then it would launch, gaining about 10 minutes off the horizontal to vertical lift procedure. So those things were worked out there at Dyess, which I think is really interesting. Just by way, it's just numbers that I think are fascinating. Let's see where I've got my notes on this. Oh, I may have them under a different section. I've worked out the numbers on the total yield capacity at Dyess, and it's shocking. I promise we'll get to that. Here you can actually see the ring of missiles around Abilene. I don't know a lot about Abilene or that area. I am familiar with Novice, Texas, kind of know where that is. And obviously you can get to Abilene eventually, you drive on I-20. But they surround, for the most part, surround the city far from the city center, with the exception of the one that's at Dyess. The point here is to separate and pull your missiles out so that it makes it more difficult for the enemy to catch all of them at the same time. This concept then goes on to be used in the deployment of Minuteman missiles, excuse me, and peacekeepers later on, none of which were deployed in the state of Texas. Okay, so let's talk about basically this kind of strange 40-year period that we're playing with. So we're going to start with the acknowledgement that this is after, or before 1960. I probably should have renamed the discussion. But we're going to start with the original single integrated operational plans done by Eisenhower. Eisenhower's doctrine was pretty simple. Everything in one go. This is the massive retaliation doctrine. That is, if we get a first strike, we think you're going to blow us up, we're going to send everything we have. This is the origin of mutually assured destruction. It starts very early on, and the reason that this is the case is partially because of the missile gap. That is, we're not as advanced yet with our missile capabilities. And secondly, we had just figured out how to work hydrogen bombs. And hydrogen bombs changed the game again. A hydrogen bomb, and I drew a picture, but I think I can explain it without the picture. A hydrogen bomb is a two-stage nuclear device. You have a primary fission stage, that is, you break atoms apart. And as you do this, you compress an additional hydrogen isotope that's fusionable, and as it fuses, my nephew is studying nuclear science, and if I'm wrong, he'll correct me. As it fuses, you get a second release of energy. So when we measured yields for Hiroshima and the original Trinity device, we measured those in kilotons, thousands of tons of dynamite. When we switch to the hydrogen device, we now measure in megatons, millions of tons of dynamite. The largest one that the United States deployed was in the 15 megaton range, 15 million metric tons of dynamite. It's considerably huge. I mean, that's a lot. You don't want to be near it. This is the massive retaliation doctrine. There are problems with this, though. It upsets balance pretty dramatically. In studying and preparing for this, I kind of found myself wishing that I had taken game theory at some point in my life. But one of the theories that's discussed in every level of this is the Nash equilibrium, and that is you have the ability to make the best decision you can, knowing what your opponent is doing, provided your opponent never changes their position. And your opponents make the best decisions they can, knowing what they know about you, provided you never change your position. Well, the problem with this massive retaliation doctrine is there is no incentive not to massively retaliate. That is, if the Soviets had decided that they were going to strike, there's no incentive for them to not send everything, because they know that our decision is to send everything. So anything that upsets that balance triggers the possibility. And that problem was later identified by Kennedy and later by Nixon with the flexible response system, or flexible response doctrine, and the Schlesinger, am I saying that correct? Schlesinger? The Schlesinger doctrine. Flexible response allows us an opportunity to de-escalate. That is, we will be very selective in what it is that we target. We may look more towards counter-force targets, that is, targets that are associated with the military, versus counter-value targets, cities and things that have value to your enemy but are not necessarily related to military operation. The Schlesinger doctrine is subtly different. In this case, he breaks it down into basically 3 key points. 1, command and control needs to have a lot of options. In the Eisenhower doctrine, they have no options. It's everything, you're done. Schlesinger says, no, that's a terrible idea. You'll never be able to de-escalate. So you need to give command and control a lot of targeting options. That is, we are going to either do counter-value, counter-force, whatever it is. It may be secondary retaliatory strikes. Secondly, if it's a Soviet first strike, targets have to be absolutely certainly selected to be military value only on your retaliatory strike. And then basically after that, the third and key point is the withhold doctrine. That is this key point in the plan that we will not retaliate subject to whether or not our withholding protects our secondary or retaliatory strike capability. It's slightly nuanced. Now, I had some difficulty with Reagan, Daryl, because it was hard for me to understand, and I'm so glad that you're here. It was hard for me to understand why the shift seems under Reagan to go back to what looks more like a mutually assured destruction policy. That is, not necessarily a we're going to let everything go in one opportunity, but during the Reagan administration, we looked for ways around mutually assured destruction, including, arguably, I would say, the Star Wars defense program, missile defense programs, and stealth capability. That is, if I can sneak one in and use a decapitation strike, that is, I take the leadership of the enemy out, then there may never be a need for a massive retaliation, or excuse me, a massive strike. But the problem with that is as we are developing these systems, that upsets the Nash equilibrium, and now the Soviets have to counterbalance that which we are adding to our ability to make these first strikes. I'll wait for the discussion section. I'm dying to hear your thought on this because I do think it's a very strange change. Okay. There's the city of Fort Worth. This is the B-36. This picture was taken by a gentleman who was visiting a museum. He's from Alaska. I just felt like putting his name there, mostly because he's from Alaska. I think that's great. We have family in Alaska. This is a large plane. This is a very large plane, and it was designed to be very large for heavy bombing purposes, primarily because early on the weight of our devices was pretty heavy. We had not yet perfected miniaturization. Largest piston-driven bomber, actually largest piston-driven plane ever deployed anywhere in the world. 230 feet is its wingspan. 230 feet. That's incredible. It entered service in 1948 as part of the Strategic Air Command, and those planes are built there in Fort Worth. Only 3 locations, Carswell, Elgin in Florida, and what is now Travis out in California. They get the bombers. These are bombers that stay in the air all the time. Maximum payload of 87,200 pounds. That's a bunch. Obviously, the plane is capable of carrying conventional weaponry, but ultimately it ends up primarily being used to carry nuclear devices. Excuse me. That included, by the way, the Mark 17 hydrogen bomb. It was the only plane that could carry it until we came out with the B-57. So in this case, the Mark 17 is about a 50 kiloton or so rated device, so about 2 point some odd amount of times greater than Hiroshima. Again, I told you the largest device we've ever deployed was 15 megatons. That has the explosive potential of 833.33 repeating devices that we dropped on Hiroshima in a single go. So 833 Hiroshimas for every one of those devices that we had. And at the time, the device numbers were in the 1,400 to 2,700 range. Which is why the escalation to a full nuclear exchange between the Soviet Union and the United States was so horrifying. It is, in fact, insanity to imagine each side. The presumption is that the Soviets must have something similar. So even if they were equal, I mean, we're talking about Hiroshima being repeated hundreds of thousands of times in one go, and that's it's not healthy. It's not healthy. Like I said before, B-36s were later retrofitted with the jet assist. It helps them with takeoff and cruising speeds. There were some concerns that they were flying too slow and that the Soviets would be able to shoot them out too quickly. The Soviets were, again, pretty far ahead of us in terms of surface-to-air missile defense, and their missiles were very easily able to catch up with the B-36. B-36 eventually gets replaced by a number of different bombers, but I would say certainly that the B-52 is the grandchild of the B-56, definitely in the same design. Nike missile systems were deployed in and around the Dallas-Fort Worth area. They were originally designed by Bell Laboratories. We were becoming increasingly concerned about the possibility that Soviet bombers would make their way over the poles and work their way essentially down the central portions of the United States, south to Texas, to take out our strategic capabilities here, catching our bombers on the ground if that was a possibility. So we looked for a surface to air defense capability. Nike missiles are our first ever surface to air defense system. They are 2-stage rockets, both with solid propellant. They have the capacity to carry conventional warheads, and the Nike Hercules, which was deployed in and around the Dallas-Fort Worth area, including in Mineral Wells, which is fascinating. We're only about 25 miles as a crow flies from that missile site. They carried the M31 nuclear warhead with a small yield of 20 kilotons. The idea of tipping these with nuclear devices is super villain brilliant. The idea is that you would nuke a Soviet incoming bomber fleet in the air, with the idea that if you caught them at the right place, radiation would drift away from the Metroplex and presumably into Arkansas or Missouri. So, sorry, Arkansas and Missouri. Sorry, Scott. I was actually, they were deployed in our area from 1960 to 1968, and out at Dyess from 1960 to 1966, which, by the way, corresponds with the same amount of time, or the same time period that we had the Atlas system deployed at Dyess. I was actually able to find, and I'm hoping I can make this work, but Mason's here, he'll help me if I can. I was actually able to, wow, it didn't work. How do I make it go, Mason?
Hit space bar, scroll your mouse up.
That didn't work.
Scroll your mouse up. Right at your screen.
Right, oh,
Yeah, you had your cursor.
I think I got it.
Screen for-
no. Help.
Yeah, so if we come off the side here.
Oh, you have to go to that one.
Don't do it.
Am I there?
Don't do it, don't press oh! I was actually able to find an original test video.
America's defenses against air attack. Guided from a missile control station, Q-5 can simulate a great variety of supersonic missiles. In this high-altitude evaluation of the Nike Hercules, the Q-5 target was carried aloft by a B-50 bomber.
I love the narration voice of all of these videos. Is it the same guy?
It's gotta be every
Nike
video of this
Hercules,
time period.
the Army's highly accurate solid-propellant air defense missile.
He just sounds so America.
Is raised to launching position. At the White Sands Missile Range in New Mexico, it rests on its launching pad in readiness for this test interception of the Q-5. As the B-50 reaches maximum altitude, the target is released. The Q-5 first falls clear, then after the boosters fire, its powerful ramjet engine will shoot it ahead at more than twice the speed of sound. Nike Hercules, in more than 500 test and training firings, has demonstrated an amazing ability to seek out and destroy various targets, from about 1,000 up to more than 150,000 feet at altitude. This intercept, altitude above 60,000 feet, target speed in excess of 1,500 miles per hour.
It's pretty remarkable that they were able to accomplish this task considering the lack of, the kind of modern technology one would assume you would need in order to track a device that's flying through the air, follow it, and hit it. In these test phases, they're using a warhead called a continuous rod, which is, I think, the same systems that were deployed on the missiles on my father's ship during the Vietnam era. And the way the system worked was that the large rods of iron or steel or some metal that were pinned together to look almost like an accordion, and they were wrapped around the warhead in a circle. They're connected together so that when the warhead deploys, this device opens in the air and kind of creates a large egg beater, for lack of a better way to describe that. And the egg beater then makes contact with the target and scrambles the egg. That's the idea. Of course, eventually the Hercules becomes nuclear tipped. That's just a bigger egg beater. It is this system, however, that leads to, I think the Hound Dog was on your ship, Dad? Talos systems. I mean, this is the precursor to all of our surface-to-air systems. They all effectively work like this system. And here's a great map that shows the deployment of the Nike missile system. You can see them there in the Dyess base. I love the way that they surround the Dallas-Fort Worth area in this kind of strange protective nuclear cone. And then Bergstrom down south. The Stratofortress, the B-52, comes both to Carswell, to Shepherd, and to Dyess, all within a reasonably close amount of time. The B-52 is a great platform for deterrence at this point because it can stay in the air for so long and because it can lift so much. It's worth noting that at some point, quickly after they are brought to both Carswell and Shepherd, that they retrofit these to carry, again, the newly deployed air-launched cruise missiles. That was a big game changer for sure with respect to our deployment capability, because now you have a system that doesn't have to cross the line. You can deploy your cruise missiles from far enough back that you can save your plane. Now, what they may be coming home and landing on is a separate question, but at least you have the capacity to ensure that these planes can take a nuclear payload within striking distance of the enemy, release that payload, and not run the risk that they're going to get shot down before they're able to execute their missions. I don't know that I would fly in one, but I would love to walk through one. So if anybody knows how to make that happen, please see me after the lecture. I'd like to see one. I don't want to fly. I don't like to fly, and I'm not getting into that thing. There's no way. I can't believe they fly anyway. They work arc light, again, like I said, from Shepard, partly from Carswell from 1965 to 1973. G&Hs are modified to take these large nuclear payloads in the 1970s. And this platform remains the heartbeat of our strategic bombing forces until we get the B-2 and the B-1. The B-1 Lancer, which we'll look at here next, and the B-2 stealth bomber. And we're still using it today. And if we keep going the way we're going, they may be making bombing runs over Syria next week. Who knows? We'll know because it'll come out in a tweet. Dear Syria, sending bombers now. The B-1 Lancer is an attempt to give us the high capacity payloads from the B-52, but with supersonic speeds and some stealth capability. These planes are not really put into service until the mid-1980s. I don't ever remember seeing any flying as a kid. And I don't know that I've ever actually even been near one. Again, this is a super large airplane with massive payload capacity. But of course, if you grew up in the Abilene area, you probably saw them all the time, because Abilene was was in fact the first place where they were deployed, and the first B-1 that was delivered for deployment was called the Star of Abilene, which I think is kind of, again, I don't know, seems a little dark to me, but there it is. This makes up another portion of that nuclear triad. And finally, the SM-65, the Atlas F. The Atlas, like we talked about before, this is this unusual missile. The missile is designed using basically captured German scientists. It's not entirely different from the V-2 systems. It's just ramped up a little larger. They made it, the intent of the balloon bladder tank was to keep the device light so that you were not exchanging your capacity to carry a large load of weaponry at the expense of the heft of the device. The lighter it is, the greater your thrust capacity. And what they end up with is a missile that's deployed pretty quickly with a 9,000-mile flight capability. That's Central Soviet Union. You're good to go. These devices carried, the ones that were deployed at Dyess Air Force Base, carried the W-38 device. This is a 3.75 megaton nuclear device, 250 Hiroshimas in a single rocket. So during its deployment years, when all 13 were deployed, that's 3,250 Hiroshimas at Dyess Air Force Base alone. That's a tremendous amount of deployed nuclear capability. Eventually, this gets replaced with the Minuteman because of the problems associated with fueling it and storing it in a hardened silo. However, we didn't scrap them. And for those of you in the room who are old enough to remember the Mercury programs or watched The Right Stuff, some of these had that wasn't a shot, Daryl.
I was looking at Tom.
Oh, poor Tom. Some of these lifted some of the first Mercury program astronauts into space. We converted them to civilian use, and in fact, I think I read that they actually were using an Atlas F to deploy rockets as recently as the 1990s. So we must have had a lot of them. Kind of an interesting. Eventually, though, the Atlas goes away. Dyess no longer has those bases. For a long time, those bases were available to buy. You could buy a missile silo and convert it into homes, and lots of people have done that. And some of them have even turned them into kind of an Airbnb thing where you can go stay in a missile silo. I'm going to suggest this to my wife. I'm not 100% sure it's going to go over real well, but that could be a fun summer road trip. Hey, baby, let's go vacation at a missile silo. We'll see. This is the machinery. This is the machinery of the Cold War that's present during, or that's present in north central Texas during the height of the Cold War. I suppose that the rational question to ask is, well, all right, we have all of this. What's the conclusion? What is, in fact, the influence that north central Texas has with respect to all of this? And the answer, I think, is that because we have eager cities who want these bases within their boundaries, their territorial boundaries, and because we have space, and that's a big one, it gave the Strategic Air Command and the Air Force and the Army Air Corps a lot of room to experiment and to grow. And because they grow, we build the large military industrial complex that we have here in the Metroplex that includes companies like Bell and Lockheed and all of the other companies that are associated with this. It's almost impossible as a manufacturer in the Dallas-Fort Worth area to buy titanium tubing at a reasonable price, and that's because there are a lot of companies here in the Dallas-Fort Worth area that are using titanium tubing for military purposes, and all of that construction and all of that development is being done right here in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. I think that the other thing that a potential other conclusion that we can take from this is that at some point the technology with respect to ICBMs outpaces the usefulness of the B-52 system as an actual permanent deterrent, because the reality became we weren't going to bomb each other. We were going to missile each other. And the B-52 takes a backseat to the ICBM, returns to its more conventional role. And in high school, we saw that in the first Gulf War and again in the second Gulf War, when we would see videos of the B-52 that looked very similar to the videos of the B-52s taken during Vietnam, where they're just dumping conventional weaponry. Beyond all of that, I would love, and I'm not a psychologist, I think that there's another question that would be really interesting, and that is with respect to the psychology of the individuals who thought it was a great idea to bring these entities in. What was happening in their head? And more to the point, how did that change? That is, as the role of each one of these facilities changes from a training facility to now part of the Strategic Air Command and so on and so forth, and that influence grows and spiders out into each one of these cities, I would be very interested to hear what the relationship change was. We're notoriously good in Texas about supporting the military, but I wonder if the people who live in and around Carswell Air Force Base at the time were really aware of where they were. I think it's arguable that they abstractly understood that Carswell might have been nuked. But I'm not quite sure, I'm not quite convinced that we ever really understood what that would really mean. It wasn't going to be a grainy black and white video of a mushroom cloud over somewhere in Japan. It was just going to be a millisecond of bright white light and then nothing. And that repeated maybe 10 times. And it would be fascinating study, and this may be appropriate for another lecture at some point after some research. I need a research assistant, so students pay attention. Would be really interested to know whether or not people really understood the nature of the mushroom cloud that they were living under. I don't know. I don't know. So get me a research assistant, I guess. I'll get one. I'll get one. Yeah. I'll get one. I'll find one. Anyway, that's what I got for you today. Any questions? Scott? I'm sure Daryl has some questions. Actually, you could help me. I'm very curious about the shift from the.
Don't forget your.
Oh yeah. Yes. If you ask a question, I get to throw things at you today. This is a microphone. You ready? Are we going to do an assist? Okay.
Well, it's not so much. It's kind of an observation. You were asking me earlier about what the shift in the Reagan administration is and why. Talking about game theory, what was prevalent during the Reagan administration was the prisoner's dilemma game theory idea. It switched to prisoner's dilemma. So that's why the switch in policy.
Explain the prisoner's dilemma to those of us.
Well, if the simplest version is you are a prisoner in one holding cell, and you have a friend that's a prisoner in another holding cell, and the interrogator tells you, "Hey, your buddy just narked on you, and we know this about you. Is it in your best interest to fess up the real situation or to keep clammed up about the real situation?" Yeah. And so, oversimplistic way of looking at it. So, basically, it's kind of what you were talking about earlier, but in this case, we want to obfuscate the point. You're an attorney, you know what that means. That's where that came from. And plus, the other thing you were talking about. It's not really true that in the nuclear triad bombers were obsolescent. They were still very much in play, at least in the 80s. Why is that? Well, because they're both inverse. Missiles and bombers are both the inverse of each other. The strength and the weakness are inverses. Missiles are quick. Bombers are slow. You can't recall missiles. You can recall bombers.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
Does beg the question, though, why it seems that we end up favoring ICBM deployment over bomber deployment. I'm assuming because it's less expensive, but that may be an incorrect assumption. Or it could simply be because it's so easy.
It's because of the MERV technology. That's why. When you have multiple independently targeted vehicles, and you can do that.
Daryl brings up a really, I thought that was raising. Daryl brings up a really good point about this idea of the being able to recall the bombers. I'm reading a book right now by Ellsberg, who is famous for the Pentagon Papers. And at the same time that he stole the Pentagon Papers, and he stole them and he admits it, he also took a lot of information from when he was working at the RAND Corporation associated with nuclear war planning and policy. And one of the things that he is talking about in his book is early on at RAND, he gets involved in this study that has to do with alert statuses and the fail-safe point. And so they fly him out to the Pacific Command, and he flies around basically the Pacific Rim, interviewing all of these different commanders, and he says, okay, so you have this fail-safe policy that says you've got an alert status, your pilots go, they get in their planes, which are presumably armed. They then take off and fly to a fail-safe point, and then a bunch of them meet there, and they fly around and they wait for an execution code. And if they don't ever get the execution code, they're supposed to fly back home. And the commanders all say, yes, this is exactly correct. And he says, now, what is the accident rate on takeoff with these planes? And it turns out that the accident rate was sort of high, but they never ran any of their alert rehearsals where the pilots didn't understand that it was just a drill, right? So they were going to try to keep the pilots out of the loop. But they never ran any of these armed with the actual device. So the pilots all knew it was a drill because they didn't have their bombs. And so then it became, well, what if you change the drill and you arm them, and the planes 1, 2, and 3 take off, and as they make a turn, plane 4 crashes, and the bomb goes off, which was actually, at the time, a real problem. We had some problems with the safety devices on some of our bombs. And as the pilots are looping, they see their family going up in a cloud. Now this pilot has to make a decision. Is that an accident, or was that a missile? So this pilot goes to the fail-safe point. He now can't receive an execute code because the base is destroyed. So what does he do? And what he found was all the commanders in the Pacific Command said, well, probably they're just going to decide to go to their targets and release. So they had to alter all of the fail-safe procedures to prevent this exact problem, that you could, improbable though it may be, you could actually end up with a sequence of events that's related to a drill where an accident occurs, a device goes off, the pilots don't receive an execution code, and they proceed to their targets and start World War III, and there wasn't a World War III. So I'm wondering, I'm assuming, and I, again, because this subject is so big and I'm on my way down that path, the fail-safe procedures by the 1980s are massively different.
That's why there was a beginning reliance in the 1980s on the submarine ballistic missile force.
Say that again?
That's why in the mid-1980s there was a shift to the reliance to the submarine ballistic.
Submarine missiles?
Yes, yes.
That's the third part of the triad. Again, we didn't talk about that today, but submarines change everything. Submarines end up becoming the tool by which we would have used decapitation strikes. That is, we're gonna give you less than 5 minutes warning, because we can get the subs in really close. The missiles will come out at a shallow angle and strike leadership targets first, with the idea that if you get the leadership targets first, you may never get a retaliatory strike. That wasn't the only thing we did with our missiles and the subs. The other thing that we planned for was secondary strikes. So you have the initial exchange, and then a year later, here comes some of our subs from under the ice cap and re-blankets the target again, just in case they're rebuilding.
It's okay, they're godless communists anyway.
Thank you, Bill. Any other questions?
I have a comment.
Yes, ma'am.
To your last point about what was the mindset, because I was saying, don't throw that thing at me. Believe it or not, I was teaching on the west side at Travis Elementary in the 60s, and we were aware of what was going on. We did regular fire drills, take the kids in a line, get them out of the building. But we did bomb drills, and we had the children get under their little desks. And that was going to make them safe. And
What was the turtle's name?
I'm feeling such a hypocrite. I'm telling my kids, get under your desk and, you'll be safe. I'm saying, no, you won't. But
Did you show the kids the video? There was like there was a service. Yeah, it was like the civil service videos, and the turtle put on a little hat, and he would duck and cover it. He'd go up in his shell. Yeah, turtles were gonna die too. Just for the record, depending on which of my friends that I talked to from when we were in upstate New York in the 80s, some of them recall us doing duck and cover drills and some of them don't. And the truth is, time's passed and some of those people have had beer and who knows what the reality is. I don't remember doing duck and cover drills at all. And I feel like that's something that they would have sent home and said, hey, we're doing duck and cover drills just so in case your kids are freaked out. But it was pointless. Duck and cover drills were absolutely pointless.
I think they were the one by the early 60s. They started, duck and cover started in the late 50s. I think early 60s.
You were kind of like,
Did that. We all-
never mind.
Thank you, Max.
It's kind of beyond that.
I have a question, and it was dealing with this various responses, and one of them was my question as I was hearing all this is, okay, if there was an initial nuclear exchange, then somehow or another the command and control is supposed to make decisions on how selective the attack, the response will be, and who to. And I'm just thinking that seems sort of ridiculous because it's going to have a very chaotic situation, and you're going to have to respond quickly.
So you have to remember that you don't have to have missiles in the air to justify putting yours in the air and calling it a retaliatory strike. This is what launch on warning got us. And I'm confident Darrell is able to remember the launch on warning discussions. So launch on warning says all I've got to believe is that a missile is coming. and then I'm going to launch. And if that's the choice that you make, this is the game theory. This is why it's so fascinating.
You use them or lose them.
You use them or lose them. And if the decision is this is legit, even if it's not, if you have a select number of counterforce targets, so not civilian population centers, not, things of I would call them almost emotional value, okay? You strike the military, use a limited first response. The other side has an incentive to back away. You didn't send everything. You were picking a counterforce target, okay? Maybe they respond with a limited counterforce target themselves, but it gives people the opportunity to back away. If we had the capacity, and we get the early warning systems in the 60s, but if we had the massive retaliatory response doctrine at the same time that we had the capacity to identify missile launches, it's much more probable that we would have erroneously detected a launch from Soviet Central Asia and sent everything, with the idea that, exactly like Daryl's saying, use it or lose it. Because if you detect one missile or 3 missiles or whatever it is, the presumption is everything else is coming. Because there's no incentive for the Soviets not to do that. So we're going to send everything. That doctrine changes later to this limited response by giving top-level commanders the ability to select targets of counterforce value so that there's incentive for both sides to back away. And that's the only way that it makes sense. Look, the truth is, it doesn't make sense at all. But that was the theory, was you got a chance to step backwards. And hopefully the other side would see that this was a counterforce strike and that you just didn't nuke Leningrad just to kill people. Yes, ma'am.
Cap this off, and as a Google gift to you, the duck and cover turtle is Bert.
Bert the turtle.
The turtle.
Bert the
Not
turtle,
my
thank
question.
We don't call it safety drills. We never mention the word bomb. We call it safety drills.
That's pretty consistent, I would say, with the kind of sterile approach that seems, in reading in all of this, it's fascinating to me that anybody ever thought they were going to win. I don't know how you could conclude you're going to send everything in one go, but we'll win. I suppose winning is relative. I think it's probably relative.
It wasn't probably until we had launched enough military satellites that you could actually detect early.
That's right.
That anything other than mutual destruction made any sense.
That's true. But even once
you couldn't possibly, you really didn't know what they did.
That's right.
Until, because you
could wait.
At that time, it was a 22-minute flight.
Right. So that exact situation happens with this guy named Stanislav from the Soviet Union. This happens, the first documents about this came out in the early 1990s. Stanislav is some low-level dude whose job it is to monitor, right? And he gets this warning that the U.S. has launched 5 missiles at the Soviet Union. And this single man, instead of passing this message on to the next level, where they almost certainly would have said, launch on warning, use them or lose them, everything goes, Stanislav says, everything that I've been taught says the United States is going to strike first with everything they have. Why are they only sending 5 missiles? Plus, it was a new missile detection system, so he decides it's not real. He goes outside of his little building, whatever he's in, and walks outside and looks in the direction of Moscow and waits. And literally that was his, and he says, if I see something go up, then I'll send a message. And he just stood there and waited for about 30 minutes, didn't see anything, and went back in, and that was it. And this one man who died in February of 2017 is kind of credited as being this strange, perfect fail-safe that prevented a potentially really serious problem, because there was a culture in the high-ups in the Soviet Union that anything, you talk about groupthink. If they'd have seen 5 missiles on a screen. That was it. Every Satan they had was coming this way, or whatever missile they had at that point. That was, Stanislav's thing happens in the late 70s. Darryl, does that sound right? I think that's right. So, pretty crazy to think that, like,
we had similar situations too.
We did.
There are 2 occasions I remember specifically where it was a flight of geese flying in front of a radar screen that looked like a flight of missiles, and but it was just a flight of geese.
and see, that's why the whole mutually assured destruction thing is so, it requires perfect balance. It requires that there are no errors in detection, and that everybody acts rationally. Well, there are always going to be errors in detection, which means you got to get everybody to act rationally. And Stanislav, and presumably whoever was manning the geese station, thankfully acts rationally as opposed to saying, this is it. You know, not that there's one button, but you know, that's pretty wild. That's a crazy thought. Other questions, concerns, issues? Well, that's it. I appreciate everybody coming. Thank you very much.